All right. If blank would just blank, everything would be better. What'd you say? If COVID would just stop. Okay, good. I agree. That'd be great. What else? If blank would just blank, everything would be better. If tacos would just appear, it would be awesome. We went to UTC today to get some Christmas shopping out of the way early because of, supply chains and everything. And my daughter was just stunned at the Sprinkles cupcake vending machine. Have you seen that? Where it's like you can literally just walk, as you're walking around, just, I feel like a cupcake today. It's like, I'm going to get a cupcake. What else? Anybody else? If blank would just blank. If it would just rain, it'd be better? You must know firemen. That's good. That's all right. Perfect. All right. Well, hey, we are so excited that you're here. My name's Kurt, and I'm one of the pastors here. And we are starting a new series, meaning it's more than 1 week. So we're calling it a series. A quick 2-week conversation around peace. And I don't know about you, but the last 18 months has just been wild. And really, if you are like me, perhaps you found yourself just feeling really discouraged. And I've had conversations with people this week where it's like, they're just going into the holidays, and again, there's concerns, there's travel questions, there's all kinds of stuff, and they're like, again, I'm just defeated. Like, we could do this for a little bit, but it's just gone on way too long, and they're finding themselves frustrated. And then, if you're like me, you turn on the news, and regardless of what station you watch, they're just there to make you angry. Right, and so that it works. You just get frustrated. There's all kinds of challenges, right? There's protesters protesting other protesters. You just get exhausted listening to all that's happening. And the question I want us to wrestle with for these next 2 weeks, intentionally before we go into the holiday season, which for many of us brings up financial stress, family stress, all kinds of other things outside of our normal stressful lives. The question I really want us to ask is, after these last few years, all of the chaos, all of what has felt like a dumpster fire of a couple years, how do we assess and perhaps even take steps forward with what all this chaos has done to our souls? Right? Like, it's easy to feel like what it's done perhaps to our mind, or our relationships, or our finances, what it's done to our bodies. I'm just finding myself being tired all the time. Maybe you're the same way. And yet there's this question of, underneath all that, that's important, but underneath all that, what has it actually done to our soul, the most important part of you, according to your maker, according to God? And so I don't know how often you think about that. I know if I don't intentionally take time to slow down and think about it, I will go right past it in my fast-paced life. And my guess is you are the same way. But perhaps for you, when you are laying in bed and you can't fall asleep, or you're kind of finding yourself in a stressful situation, and you ask the question, how do I get through what I'm going through? And what do you do when you feel like you can't get through what you're going through? And so today, and then next week, we're going to look at this conversation around what the Bible says about how you and I can find this elusive, missing thing that we all crave, which is actually what Christmas promises, right? Peace on earth, right? How do we have that peace in my life, right? Peace on earth, that's great. I need peace at my address. Anybody else, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about. So today, we're going to look at how do we find peace within. And then next Sunday, I hope you come back, we're going to look at how do we find peace around us. How do we create perhaps even peace at our work, in our family, when we go travel for Christmas or whatever it is we have in our life, all right? And so today, we are looking at a passage in Philippians Chapter 4, written by the Apostle Paul. And to give you some context before you turn there, the Apostle Paul, as we wrapped up Future Church last week, Katie talked about how he had been stranded on a desert island. He was shipwrecked, stranded on a desert island. And then not only was that difficult enough, he gets there, he goes to cook some food, and a snake jumps out of the fire and bites him. And I'm just like, that would have been enough. I would have just been like, God, I'm done, right? And so maybe that's how this last year has felt for you. You've been shipwrecked, you're on a desert island, and then you got bit by a snake, right? So Paul then finally makes it to Rome, right? He makes it to Rome. And for a couple years, as we wrapped up the book of Acts, he is unfettered. He is not hindered at all, which is an amazing reality. His obedience through all his hardship gets him to a place where he's able to share about the love of Jesus in the place he wanted to be. And it sounds really great. If you were just close the book of Acts and be like, man, that's so awesome. God answers all his prayers. I wish that would happen for me, but good for you, Paul. And if you didn't know the rest of the story, you can end the book of Acts and be just like, man, like it's hard for me. Like how come nothing relates to me in the Bible? I don't know if you've ever felt that way. And yet what we know from history is that a few years later, after about 2.5 years in Rome, Paul ends up getting arrested. And he finds himself in a Roman prison, yet again in prison. And he's chained not only to a cell block, but also there's guards standing over him. And again, this is a guy who was much more dangerous before he started following Jesus than he was after starting following Jesus. But he gets arrested because he's talking about his belief that Jesus is actually king. Jesus is actually the one that he's given his allegiance to, not to Caesar. And so this subversive idea that he's kind of propagating around Rome is more dangerous than any violence he created in his life previous to following Jesus. And so he finds himself trapped in prison, and many of us would find ourselves in a tough situation like that and go, hey, I'm out. I can't continue to do the thing that God's called me to do. And yet Paul continues to write letters to other friends, churches that he had planted along the Mediterranean rim on his way in hopes of getting to Rome. And one of those letters that he writes is to the church in Philippi, which we call Philippians. And so now, if you have a Bible, I'd like to invite you to turn to Philippians Chapter 4. If you're here in the auditorium, we would love to grab the Bible in the seat back pocket in front of you. It makes it easy. We're all reading off the same page. It's on page 710 in this Bible. If you're watching online, we're so glad that you're here. You can open another tab and turn to Philippians Chapter 4. And again, Paul writes this from prison. Now, so this is really, really important. This is the context out of which these words show up for us, because it's important, because perhaps the first few sentences that we're going to read together can feel a little off-putting if we don't know the context, all right? So I'm just naming that up front. So he writes this, and this is kind of wrapping up this letter that he's got one shot to write some notes to some friends in a church in Philippi, kind of far away. And so he's really condensed. That's why most of these little books in the Bible are short. He didn't know he was writing the scriptures. He was just writing to some friends. And so he wraps up his letter to his friends in Philippi by writing this, starting in verse 6 of Philippians chapter 4. He says, and don't worry about anything. Sure. Sounds easy enough. Thank you for illuminating that to us, Paul. Right? Don't worry about anything, but instead pray about everything. It says, tell God what you need and thank him for all that he's done. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything that you can understand. Again, in prison, he writes these words. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus. And so now, my dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. It says, fix your thoughts, right? Focus your attention on what is true, on what is honorable, on what is right and pure and lovely, on what is admirable. He says, think about these things that are excellent and worthy of praise, and keep putting into practice all that you have learned and received from me, everything you heard from me and saw me doing. And then he repeats this line, and then the God of peace will be with you. Now again, this first little intro, like, don't worry about anything, right? Other translations say, don't be anxious for anything. And you're like, great. I mean, I have to go to my doctor for anxiety medication, but sure, Paul, don't be worried about anything, right? And I just wanted you to hear this. Like, what we're not talking about for these next 2 weeks is something that would keep you from listening to medical advice. Just want to put that out there at the front end, right? We believe in that. If you see a professional counselor, if you have medications for what you have walked through in your life, anxiety, depression, whatever, I'm with you. I share that experience. That does not mean you have a lack of faith, okay? That's important to get out on the front end. But what we are talking about is how each of us in our life have spaces where it is very easy for our minds to go to a worst case scenario situation and to think of all the things that could go wrong, or all the things that feel like they are going wrong in our lives. And so this is where Paul is saying there's actually some things that we can do. There's some practices, there's some adjustments, there's some ways we can fix our focus or fix our eyes to allow us to live the life that God has actually designed for us to live. Because life is going to throw all of us some out of control moments, right? No matter what is going on in your world, right? No matter what, status you have financially, or what degree you have, or where you work, or whether you're married or single again, whether you have kids or not. There are things in our life that might create slightly more chaos in some seasons than others, but all of us are going to have moments in our life where we have cards that we are dealt that are going to create this anxiety in our emotions, that are going to create this space of anxiousness, of worry. And what Paul is saying is that actually the most counterintuitive and yet transformational thing that you can do in those moments when you feel anxious, when I feel anxious, is actually to focus our attention on God and what he's done. To actually slow down, to offer God, to tell God, to share in prayer with God the things that we're feeling, and to also praise him and thank him for what he's done. Which does not feel like what I want to do in those moments. Let's just get that out, right? Let's be honest. When I'm feeling stressed, when things aren't going my way, when I have a problem I'm trying to solve and it's keeping me up at night, the last thing that I think naturally in my own life to do is, you know what? I should just put on some worship music, and just like really like have it out with God and just worship right now. Like that's not usually what I do. I scheme, or I freak out, or I lose sleep, or I medicate, or I retreat, or I just binge Netflix and try to find escape. And that's what we do, is we usually try to find relief rather than peace. And yet we have to come back to that relief over and over again because it never fully satisfies that ache, that feeling, that desire that we have for real peace. And so what Paul is saying is not that our ideas of prayer and going to God, we're going to talk about in just a second, that takes away what's happening. It's not to move our attention away from what is really true, what is really going on in our life. But it's actually to remind our heart, to recalibrate and center our soul that what is going on is not all that is going on. Right? Again, Paul is writing this from a prison cell where his circumstances would have told him, hey, this is the end. Like, this is not a good situation. And yet out of that difficult circumstance, we have all of these letters that we have now put together as what we call the Bible, right? That even in spaces where things feel difficult, anxious, or challenging, God can still be at work. And this wasn't theory for Paul, right? He was living this in his present moment as he's penning or narrating these words. So what Paul is saying when he says don't be anxious about anything, he's not saying that worry isn't a thing that you have to battle with. All he's saying is that there's actually a better way. Right? That worry doesn't have to be the only way. That being anxious about something doesn't have to be the only way that we can pursue our problems. And I would put it this way, is that worry is actually meditation in the wrong direction. That worry is meditation in the wrong direction. So when he says, don't worry about anything, but pray about everything, he's literally saying, don't do this, which is very common in how Paul wrote these words to different churches throughout the New Testament. And so here's my encouragement for you, although it might not feel like it, on the surface encouragement. If you are good at worry, anybody here like me, you're good at worrying, like it just comes naturally to you. It's not on the spiritual gift list, but if it was, you really, you'd like, God, I want to contend with that, right? If you're naturally good at worrying, you're already good at praying. You're already good at praying, as Paul says in this passage, because when I worry, I'm actually rehearsing and repeating and revealing all the things that are true in my soul to no one that can do anything about it. Or worse, to myself, thinking I can do something about it, which is why I get in that situation in the first place. And all prayer is saying, do that exact same thing. Do that exact same practice. Just do it with God. So many of us, we were raised in religious tradition, and we have like certain prayers that we might, pray over and over again, and they feel lofty, or they feel disconnected from us. And what Paul is saying is actually the best prayers you can pray are just as vulnerable, just as honest, just as PG for language perhaps, as your worries are. You just do it with God. Instead of just going, God, how am I going to figure this out? I gotta do this. I gotta scheme to do this thing for the business thing. If they would only, do all that stuff, and you kind of go through all of these things. If they would only this, then it would be better. If she would only this, if my coworker would just, if my boss would just recognize how great I am, whatever it might be in your mind, you say, actually, I want to do that same thing. I want to go through that same narrative just with God. And for many of us, right, we think that God only wants to hear our praises, which is why it's so hard in moments of anxiety or worry or lack of peace to feel like we can come to God, when actually what Paul is saying is you can actually bring all of what you're experiencing to God just as you are. That God is just as honored when you show up authentically saying, this is me, this is what I'm going through, this is what's hurting right now, that God is just as honored in that space as he is when you sing a worship song. And so when we come to God, it's again back to the first line of Philippians where Paul is writing this. He says, show up with God, right? And instead of worrying, pray about everything, right? The Greek word that he used there really translates to everything, anything. Can I pray about that? Yeah, absolutely. Well, can I pray about my job? Yes, absolutely. Can I pray about my marriage? Absolutely. Whatever is on our heart, whatever is burdening you, Paul says you can actually bring that to God. And then after you've done that, you can thank him for all he's already done. And here's what's important for us to understand, is that pairing, both sides of that, is what really makes our prayer life effective, our prayer experience with God effective, not necessarily in getting God to do what we asked him to do. Because the goal of prayer is never to change God. The goal of prayer is for actually my heart and my life to be changed by God. So when I come to God and I say, this thing, I'm really wanting it, or this thing I'm really frustrated by, or this thing I really don't know how I'm going to figure this out, and a lot of people are depending on me. And I'm scared, and I'm frustrated. Or I don't know where to turn. I don't know what to do. It's causing me anxiety. And then I say, God, thanks that I'm in this situation where I actually have the responsibility to lead other people. Thanks that I'm in this situation because I thought I was out 6 months ago. Thanks so much for this little person that I've prayed for 2 years that now is 6 and drives me crazy sometimes. You have those moments where you actually have this balance and you leave that experience not with everything fixed, but with your eyes more fixed on Jesus. And that's actually the goal of how we actually attain peace, is because it reminds us what God has already done. I was having a conversation with a friend this week, and we were sharing this, and the conversation kind of naturally, as it does, I don't know, maybe for you it doesn't, but for me it does, it naturally just rolls into how hard things have been. It naturally just rolls into all the things that we're frustrated about, or the things that haven't gone our way, or the real pain that we're experiencing in business or in our marriages or whatever it might be. And then he just said, why is it so hard for things to be able to be celebrated? And it was just this challenging question where I was like, oh yeah, actually there are so many silver linings that have come out of even the hardest situations in my life. And in my view, as I was preparing for this message, I was like, that's exactly what Jesus, I think, wants to do, is to show us that even when things look difficult or look challenging or aren't going the way we thought they should, to remind us that he is still working. He is still in the mix. And then, as God would have it, another friend messaged me and asked that same question. And I was like, this is obviously resonating for a lot of us, that we're kind of over being disappointed. And although that's real and important to name, it's also important, as Paul showed us, to kind of do that back and forth of, hey, this is real, this is what I'm desiring, but also, God, this is what you have done through this experience. This is how you have been good to me. And I know that at times it doesn't seem to make any sense, but when we are invited by Jesus into a posture of prayer that allows us to both share honestly and praise authentically, the question for many of us, and this might push you a little bit, and I don't know where you are in the spiritual spectrum, but if we're honest, most of us do neither of those things fully because it's safer to stay in the center. I don't want to tell God what I'm really interested in or what I really want, because then if I go there, I'm vulnerable enough to get disappointed again, right? And I don't want to praise you. I don't want to say thank you because there's all this other stuff that's still undone and on the floor in pieces in my life. And so this practice of understanding that Jesus is inviting us to fully and freely show up authentically with who he is and what he wants to do in our life, that is where we find peace. But when we don't engage that, often that's why we're left wanting and we have to settle for relief. See, Jesus says this throughout his time on the planet, and Paul is sharing this in this letter to the Philippians, and I believe is speaking to us as well, is it's okay to start at the surface. Just to start what's on top of mind, that's an important place to start. But actually what God is inviting us into is something deeper, to hang with him. And it might take slowing down a little bit. And I know you're busy, me too. It might take slowing down just a little bit to let the Spirit work out something that might be beneath the surface for you. It's okay to share that's frustrating, but to ask yourself the question, why does she frustrate you so much? Why does that coworker always get under your skin? What's going on in me? What's going on in you that makes us so easily offended? I get it. The world is not as it should be. Jesus is very clear on that, and so is the news. But what can we bring to hearing those situations that are occurring? Can we bring peace, or do we simply add fuel to the fire in the comment section or in the conversations with friends or in our own heart? And I think those are the questions that I think Jesus actually wants us to get to more deeply, because that's where we actually find consistent peace that can be so elusive. Because we're familiar with imperfect peace or circumstantial peace or inconsistent peace, right? Can you relate? When things go well, when the peace of this world means my circumstances lined up according to plan, I've found it in the last couple of years for me that if I'm honest, I don't even need things to go well. I just need them to go according to plan. Even if I plan for things to go poorly, I would rather be prepared. Right? We did a calendaring meeting for 2022 as a staff this week, and I just found myself and other members of the team sharing this, like, we were excited for a calendaring meeting. Like, let that sentence linger for a second, how crazy of a sentence that is. We were excited for a calendar meeting because it seems like 2022 we could actually plan for. What a treat, and so for many of us, maybe you feel that same way, like, I just want things to go according to plan, and yet that doesn't have peace attached to it. That just has the absence of fear or the absence of chaos. But God says, actually, my presence brings perfect peace. So what is perfect peace? Like when Paul says the presence of God, that God promises you and I, regardless of our situation, perfect peace, what does that mean? And actually, it's an old Jewish idea that Paul brings into the way of Jesus, and it's this word shalom, right? And actually, that was a Jewish greeting. It actually doesn't just mean peace, like the absence of conflict, but it's actually a double word where it means peace and wholeness, or better translated, fullness or completeness. That what God promises you and me when we come before him and fix our eyes on him and we engage in his presence authentically, both asking and sharing what we need and praising him for what he's already done, celebrating who he is, that he promises that his perfect peace will be with us, his shalom, his wholeness, his fullness. And yet for many of us, if we're honest, that's where the core idea of our anxiety really roots from, is a question of, where do I stand with God? Is God for me? Is God present? Does God care? And for many of us, these questions have come rushing to the surface over these last 18 months in new ways. Are there things in my life that I'm ashamed of that God's actually ashamed of me as well? Are there people in my life that make me frustrated or bitter that does God see? Does God care about them? Or is God angry at them just like I am? And all of these moments in our life that kind of bring this like conglomeration of an experience with God together, it makes us ask the question, like, do I really have peace with God? You can follow Jesus, you can go to church, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question, have I received and obtained peace with God that he promises will guard and guide our hearts and reframe our souls and fill us up in that deep place that no matter how much chaos is happening in the world, it can't touch that. See, what Paul's simply saying here is that God's promise to you is not to fix your problems, which on the surface does not sound like great news. But it actually is the best news. Because if God just fixed your problems, you would have more problems in the future. God says, actually, I'm going to empower and do something inside of you that no matter what you face in the future, you bring with it a peace that can show up in that moment. Not only just for you, but perhaps, as we're going to look at next week, can even create peace in a chaotic moment out there. But I'm going to do something in you that's going to be able to bring peace, fullness, wholeness, completeness, shalom with you. I'm going to do something in you that's for you, but also through you to the world. And see, this is God's invitation, that we would live lives rooted in worship rather than worry. That you and I would live lives rooted in worship rather than worry. That gratitude can become this antidote to the anxiety that I feel. That's saying thank you. Not that everything is fine or everything's perfect or put together, but that God, thank you for how you're moving. I'm looking, I'm seeing. There's things, even in the most chaotic and disappointing circumstances that might surround me, there are things in my life that are admirable, that are beautiful, that are worthy of praise. And I'm not going to hold back on sharing that with you as well. And see, this is so important, because when we are filled up and living from a centered soul, it doesn't matter how out of control the world feels, we can actually walk through it with confidence, just like that song that we just sang says. Right? That God promises that he's going to give us something far greater in the exchange than just removing the challenges in our life. In fact, in the Gospel of John, Jesus' best friend records Jesus saying this as he's kind of wrapping up his time with his followers on the planet. He says, hey, I've told you all of this, right? Which is really the end of everything that he said, right? I've told you all of these things so that you may have, what's the word? Peace. It's okay. I'll try that again. I didn't warn you, right? I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask you what's the word. You can actually say it out loud. It's okay, right? Jesus says, I've told you all of these things so that you may have peace in me. I mean, in a couple of weeks, we're going to celebrate Christmas, and Jesus is described as the Prince of Peace, and he closes his ministry, his time on the planet, saying, I've told you all the things I've told you so that you can have peace in me. But then he says this next sentence. Here on earth, though, you're going to have all kinds of trials and sorrows, right? Just being honest, right? Jesus always shoots it straight. But take heart, because I've overcome the world. So I've told you these things. I've led you the way I've led you. I've spent time with you the way I've spent time with you. I've taught you and shown you who God is the way I've taught you and shown you who God is, so that you can have peace in me, because you will not find it here, is basically what John 16 is saying. Jesus says, I've told you so that you can have a peace that is out of this world, because in this world you will not find it. And this is what is so challenging, is because if we're honest, we're often looking for peace in things of this world, even people of faith. We find peace in financial security, or in a relationship, or in a marriage that is actually working the way we thought it would when we got married, right? We were at Nick and Leandra's wedding here at Restoration Church yesterday, and their vows, we love Nick and Leandra, they're so great. Well, their vows were so powerful to me, because I'd never heard it before, but they said, I take thee, right, you talk to your spouse at the altar, to be exactly who you are. And I just thought, man, what a powerful sentence. Like, I almost like, man, I steal that and do that at the next wedding I officiate. Right? That's super, super good. Because so often we stand at that moment where we have all these hopes and dreams for the person across from us. And when they disappoint us, when they don't add up to our invisible, usually uncommunicated expectations, it causes a whole lot of not so peaceful days in our home. Maybe you've experienced that as well. I have, right? And so the idea of saying, I'm going to take you for exactly who you are. I'm going to be open to growing with you. I think it's such a beautiful, authentic promise to make on that day. I love that. But this is the invitation for God to say, God, will you take me exactly as I am in this moment? Do you feel that? Like to check in and be honest, do you feel that level of freedom with God to say, I can show up exactly as I am? I can show up authentically with the frustrations I have, with the doubts I carry, with the things I've done, with the current state of my finances, the current state of my marriage, the current state of my anxiety. Can you show up to God and say, this is me? And in spite of all the circumstances that are difficult in my life, here's where I've seen you at work, and I'm grateful. I think this is such a beautiful invitation that challenges us to look for peace, not in this world, but outside of it. Because when our mind is fixed on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, we're not going to find peace there, friends. Hopefully you already know that. This is brand new information, right? That's not their job. That's not even their intent, is to give you peace. Their intent isn't even just to give you information. Their intent is to actually create chaos. So you keep watching, or you buy what they're selling. You're not going to find perfect peace if your mind is fixed on the future. What if? What about? How do I? You're not going to find it there. You're not going to have perfect peace if your mind is fixed on your finances, whether good or bad. That's not going to give you peace. Some of the most wealthy people I know, and their eyes are fixed on their finances, they have so much anxiety. I'm like, literally, you could pay my entire year's salary and you wouldn't even notice. Why are you stressed out about money? Because you're not going to find peace in your finances. You're not going to find perfect peace when your mind is focused on your diagnosis. It's not going to be found when your mind is fixed on the feud you have with your neighbor. It's not going to be found. You're not going to find perfect peace when your mind is focused on the problems of other people or what you wish they would do for you. You're not going to find perfect peace in another person when that relationship comes, when our relationship goes to the next step, when our relationship gets healed. You're not going to find it there. You will only find it when you find it with Jesus. That is the only place that you and I can find perfect peace, is when we fix our eyes on Jesus. The Hebrew word for fix that's translated there is the word samach, which is fun to say, right? Samach. And what it really means, it's similar to the idea of, in Deuteronomy, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. It literally means to lean, to rest fully. We have folding chairs at my parents' house, and I was sharing with my kids when they're leaning back, whenever they're in a folding chair, that when I was about 8 or 9 years old, we were at my parents' house for Thanksgiving. All the family was over, and I was leaning back on one of those folding chairs. And you get to that point where, like, you aren't leaning on the table, but you're really leaning on the chair. And because it's a folding chair, it just folded in half with me caught in the middle. And it just kind of V'd me, and I fell over on the back of my head. It was great. It explains a lot. And I would share with my kids. I'm like, don't lean back on a folding chair because, it may not support you. And eventually it'll fold on you and fall over, and you'll be embarrassed like your dad was, right? And yet that's what we do. At 9, it was a folding chair at Thanksgiving, but at 35, it's my bank account, or it's my marriage, or it's my boss's opinion. At 45, it's my kid's opinion. Whatever it might be for us, right? It's how am I competing with the neighbors, or it's what is, the 401k say right now, or what's the last quarter's earnings, whatever it might be for us. We lean on it, and what Paul is saying is, actually, the best thing you can lean on, the only thing that's not going to fold and collapse and tip over on you, that you can lean on, is what God says about you. It's how God sees you. Because when it says we're going to share in that passage that Paul writes in Philippians 4, right? When it says in verse 6 and 7, right, that we will bring to God, right? We will, instead of worrying, we're going to pray about everything, and we're going to share what's in our hearts. That phrase, right, that phrase of share is better translated reveal. That we're going to reveal what's already true. And the beauty of this reality is that when we are in life and relationship with Jesus, is that we're not revealing to him new information, but because he cares about us, he wants us to reveal it for what it will do in our souls, how it will grow us. Because when we reveal, when we show up, when we say, hey, this is really who I am, this is really what's going on, that we actually engage with God in a fresh and new way, where we find ourselves feeling accepted for who we really and truly are. But for most of us, our thoughts and our desires don't line up, right? Like, I want to be a person of faith, but I'm holding all these doubts. I want to be a person of peace, but I'm riddled with anxiety over things that I can't control. I want to be a person of love, but this person just really bothers me, right? And what scientists and psychologists would call that is cognitive dissonance, right? It's this idea when our thoughts and our beliefs and our actions don't line up with each other. And so the question for us today is not, how do we fake it till we make it with God? How do I pretend to have peace? Because you'll never find perfect peace if you are pretending. But how do I actually line up my thoughts, line up my actions, line up my beliefs in a way that it is congruent and authentic and full of what the Bible calls integrity? Doesn't mean I did everything right. It means that I'm actually taking a step towards wholeness. I'm being honest with myself and honest with God. And that, even though that might be scary, is actually the step towards perfect peace. That you will find peace when our thoughts and our beliefs line up with our actions. And so for many of us, we wouldn't consider ourselves hypocritical or inauthentic or fakers, but at some level to ask the question, is my inner world and my outer world looking a lot the same, or are they looking more different than I would like to admit? And there's no judgment there, right? Because again, we're revealing something that God already knows. But do we let our minds stay focused on the things that he's inviting us to focus on? Not to avoid reality, because that's not actually our problem, but to actually focus in and engage with what God is saying is true. And so this week, for some homework, if you want to find perfect peace, which I think all of us do, right? Pay attention to, where does your mind drift? Where does your mind go? When you're left to yourself, when you're left on your own, does your mind drift to things that are, as Paul would describe, right? Honorable, lovely, pure, admirable, worthy of praise, excellent? Or would you say, if I'm honest, my mind drifts towards things that are the opposite of that? My mind drifts towards people that I'm angry with, or to situations that I can't control. Guys, does our mind drift to someone other than the person we're in relationship with? Our significant other, our spouse, our wife. Right? Does our mind drift towards things that we think we have influence over that actually our experience would tell us we can't impact? Do we waste all of our energy on things we can't control rather than doing the things right in front of us that perhaps we can actually influence? This is what Jesus wants us. This is what the Apostle Paul invites us to think about this week, is, are we fixing our eyes, focusing our thoughts on the things that Jesus say are true and are good in the world, because they're there to be found? And can we authentically show up with the things that are broken in our own life? So here's what I want to leave you with, is this idea, right? We've kind of circled around it, but just to put it into a succinct phrase that hopefully can go with you this week as you think about peace. Again, next week we're going to talk about peace out there. This week we got to do our own homework. Well, how do I find peace in here? The truth is that peace is not found on the outside. It is formed on the inside. That the only way, the only hope you and I have of experiencing perfect peace in this life is to let God form it in us, in spite of perhaps what's happening around us. And so here's what I want us to do as we kind of close out, right? There's so many times in my life when I'm thinking about things that are causing me to worry, or causing me to be anxious, right? And I want to engage in this practice, but it's so difficult because I want to hold on to control. I want to hold on to the things that I can influence. I want to, if I'm honest, think that I'm more in control of my life than I actually am, right? So to give you a practice as you feel it before we leave, again, I want you to pay attention to where your mind goes this week, but before you leave today, I want you to do something with me, right? We do this around here, but to kind of give us a focus, I want you to take your hands, put yourself on your lap, take your hands and just make a fist as hard as you can. And I want you just to hold it for a couple seconds, right? Like squeeze, you're squeezing hard. Squeeze a little harder. You got a little more in you. Do it. Squeeze. Like feeling the blood pulse through your forearms, right? If you're holding a fist right, your first finger is starting to feel it, a little pressure, maybe going just a little bit numb. And on the count of 3, I want you just to open your hands. 1, 2, 3. Feel that? That's what I want you to experience this week. That's what I want you to experience in your life. If your hands like mine, they're a little cold, they're like, whoa, something just left. And so for you this week, when you get in that space where your heart, your soul, your muscles in your chest, your back, whatever, you feel yourself being overcome with anxious thoughts, that you're worrying, you're meditating to no one, you're meditating in the wrong direction, would you just sit for a moment and clench your fists and then just release it? To move your body into a posture where you say, God, I'm letting go of the things I can't control. I know I'm not going to find peace out there. Even if this problem went away, there's going to be another one on its heels. Would you form something in me that I can bring with me into my situations? Because I know peace is not found out there. And if I'm honest, I've been looking all over the place for peace out there, and that's why I'm finding myself more and more anxious. Would you do something in me? Would you focus my heart, my thoughts on what is good, on what is true, on what is beautiful? And when you and I, when we do that in our life, when we look for the good, when we look for the beauty, when we look for the truth, it will lead us to God. When you look for the good in your coworker, it will lead you to see God in her. When you look for the good in your spouse who is driving you crazy, or your kids that are making you want to pull your hair out, when you look for the good, you will see the imprint and the fingerprint of God in them. When you look on the news and the world feels like it's falling apart on fire, when you look for what is true and admirable and excellent, even in a world that it looks nothing like what God intended for it to look like, I believe even there, because of how good God is, you will find him. We can fix our eyes on Jesus. The scriptures say, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith, and invite him to perfect something in us, even in the midst of chaotic circumstances. So let's pray. Let's actually go to God together. Again, we pray with open hands around here for this exact reason. We want to put our body in a posture of what we want our soul to feel. So it's just as we did that exercise, again, let's just take a second, clench a fist, and then just exhale and release and open your hands. God, we want to actually live this way, not just pray this way. We want to actually be open-handed to how you're moving and what you're doing, even when we can't see it in our circumstances, that you would do something so transformative in our hearts that the circumstances around us, while they may rattle us, we would be centered and anchored in our soul to you. God, I pray that we would take the steps to come before you authentically, to actually reveal what is true in our hearts, what's true in our lives, what's true in our minds, so that we don't experience the anxiety that comes from cognitive dissonance, but we would actually find peace in relationship with you. God, help us this week, even if it's just a few minutes in the morning, or to have that moment where we notice our mind wandering towards the negative, or towards anger or bitterness or judgment. We would say, whoa, I want to pause. God, would you bring peace in me in that moment? And we open our hands to you and say, what can I be grateful for? Would you help me stop worrying because I know I don't face it alone? And I believe that when we do that, God, you would lead us to the places that there are action steps for us to take, that we can actually influence peace in our homes, in our marriages, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, on our teams, on our campuses, and when there are places that we can do nothing about it. If we're honest, that's where we love to hang out, because there's no responsibility. But when we would recognize that we can't do anything about it, we would actually lean, we would trust, we would lean fully on you, knowing that you may be working in ways we cannot see, even through circumstances we would not choose. And for that, we can praise you. If for nothing else, we can say, God, thank you that you work in ways that I cannot see. So I pray for any of my friends here in this room, or any of them watching online, or anyone from the sound of my voice listening to this later, that are in a space where this peace feels elusive. And say, yeah, I'm missing some peace internally. I pray for any of them that don't know where they stand with you, that they would know that you have made up your mind about them. That there's nothing that they could share or reveal that would make you turn away or take a step back, but that because of Jesus, they are already seen, loved, and accepted, and that they can reach out to you. And for those of us that have decided to follow you, we know that doesn't fix our problems or make our life perfect all of a sudden, but it does give us someone to turn to. And so may this week, may we stop worrying and start praying. May we come back next Sunday before we focus on anyone else and how to create peace with anyone else in our life. Would we take a step to worry less and to pray more, to acknowledge your presence, and to express gratitude for all you've done in our life. Jesus, it's in your name that we pray all these things. Amen.